spent 6 years of my life as a camp counselor in Hayward, Wisconsin at a Y camp. And as many of us who've been camp counselors will attest, some of our most important lessons we learned were from being at camp and from being on staff. I remember my first summer, they were trying to teach us how to work with the kids if they needed to be punished. They did things that were wrong. How should we handle what they had done? And they taught us that summer that really the best methodology is what we learned was called logical consequences. That if they weren't willing to put on their life jacket correctly, then they would be punished by not being allowed to go water skiing or sailing. That if they wouldn't clean up an art class, they wouldn't be allowed to work on their project the next day in class. This seemed to make a lot of sense to me, and certainly was a lot better than a counselor that I once had who would punish us by making us sit on the toilet looking at the inside of the door when she was angry with us. That didn't seem to make any sense at all, not a logical consequence. And really what I learned from logical consequences is that we need to take responsibility for our actions. During this Torah portion this week, they're consecrating the Mishkan, the wilderness tabernacle, and a tragedy occurs. Now Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, each took his fire pan, put fire in it, and laid incense on it, and they offered before the eternal alien fire, which had not been enjoined upon them. And the fire came forth from the eternal and consumed them. Thus they died at the instance of the eternal. Nadav and Avihu, Aaron's two sons, they offered Esh Zarah, a foreign fire, and they died. There was a tragedy. The reasons were given for their death. They were drunk, they were arrogant, and they approached the sanctuary with a sacrifice that wasn't asked for. The rabbis couldn't agree, but they felt that they had done something wrong. But it seems like a rather harsh punishment for two young men who were young, maybe a little exuberant, maybe didn't use the best judgment. They weren't really punished. This was a logical consequence, unfortunately, of bad behavior. If you play with fire, you might get burned. It's tragic that something like this happened. And when one engages in this kind of risky behavior, we can't necessarily say it's unfair, but we can say it's a tragedy. One of my pet peeves, as I think many of you know, is that we use the word unfair incorrectly. We usually say something's unfair when something doesn't go our way or we don't get something we want. As I used to say to my children when they would say, "It's unfair," when they didn't get something they wanted for dinner or a particular toy, and I would say, "You're right, life is unfair, you get more than you deserve." But perhaps what happened to Nadav and Avihu was fair, a logical consequence, but it was tragic. But our discomfort with this accident is deeper than this. Because of course, if we only could live our life according to strict judgment, we would find it pretty unbearable. We need compassion as well as judgment. On the high holy days, we call God Avihu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, to represent these two parts of God's personality. That God is Avihu, God is our parent, God is merciful and loving, but God is also Malkeinu, God judges us. And we know that we'd all be found wanting if we were measured on a strict measure of justice. And so we say on the holy days, God, please don't measure us by the strict measure of judgment. No human being could stand. We all make mistakes. We also know that as human beings, we are all impartial in our judgment, that perhaps God could judge us fairly, even if maybe a little more harshly than we wanted to be judged. But as human beings, how do we judge others? It's very hard for us to be objective. Most of us are very subjective. In their book, Noise, A Flaw in Human Judgment, Daniel Kahneman, who is the author of Thinking Fast and Slow, and Cass Sunstein show how we can make incorrect judgments because of a lot of noise that is around us. It used to be, for example, that there were no sentencing guidelines, and so judges, when somebody was guilty, would have to decide how long one's punishment would be, how long they would have to stay in prison. And what was found is that there was a massive discrepancy depending on which judge the case came in front of. It might say that the punishment for this case is 0 to 25 years, and that's a huge spread, and depending on the judge, a similar case could find itself with many different punishments. This led to the Sentencing Reform Act of 1984, in which guidelines for sentencing that restricted the range of sentencing for any type of crime helped to reduce this, because it got rid of the noise, the human subjectivity. Unfortunately, this law was struck down for technical reasons by the Supreme Court in 2005, and lo and behold, it resulted in a pendulum swinging back to wide variability in sentencing. Same law, different outcomes. Why? Our judgment is influenced by many things: our experiences, our backgrounds, our prejudices, the societal norms in which we live. And we need to pay attention to our subjectivity if we want to create a truly just system. This is where the notion of privilege comes into play. And privilege as it exists in our society, sometimes we think it's just about the color of our skin, but it's more than that. There's gender privilege, socioeconomic status in which we might be more privileged than others. And what does it mean to be more privileged in society? It doesn't mean that the law is different. Everybody has the same law. But certain people are given a little more benefit of the doubt. Certain people have behaviors that are overlooked. And that certain classes of people are judged as individuals, while others are seen as representing their gender, their race, their religion. This week, during the Supreme Court hearings for Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, these kinds of privileges were fully on display. As she was being questioned, she was calm in the face of being yelled at, grandstanding, and insinuating she was a terrorist and a child sex trafficker. I can't imagine how she was so calm in the face of some of the ridiculous behavior and absurd comments that were being made. We can only imagine what would happen to her candidacy if she displayed the same intemperance that Brett Kavanaugh displayed at his hearings. But he was given a pass because he had the privilege of being white and male. Additionally, during the hearings this week, she was asked her opinion on Ibram X. Kendi's children's book, Anti-Racist Baby. Why should someone who is being questioned about whether or not they could be a Supreme Court justice be asked to opine about this? This makes absolutely no sense. But of course, Ibram X. Kendi is black and she's black, and so we can ask these questions. People of the same race or gender are often lumped together and thought to hold the same opinions or represent the same points of view. They aren't given the privilege of being seen as an individual. Even when this is not done in a hostile manner, as was the case this week, it is still detrimental and discriminatory. This year in June, we're going to celebrate 50 years since women were ordained, 50 years of women in the rabbinate. I remember the 20th anniversary of Women in the Rabbinate. I was in rabbinic school, and we had a conference at the Hebrew Union College in New York to celebrate this wonderful milestone. At one of the small group discussions, there was a woman in the room as we were talking about female rabbis who said, "My congregation, a few years ago, we hired a female rabbi. We were so excited." Of course, 30 years ago, there weren't nearly as many female rabbis as there are now, and many people had not yet hired them. And she said, "We made a real effort because we thought this would be good to have some diversity in our congregation. And so we did. We hired a female assistant rabbi. And you know what happened? It didn't work out. She didn't really fit in with the congregation, and she wasn't who we needed. And so when her contract was up, she left. And then she paused, and she said, "So now we have to find a new rabbi. But we can't look for another woman. We'll have to look for a man this time because it didn't work out with the woman." And I looked at her, flabbergasted. And I took a deep breath, and I said, "Can you repeat that story and change the pronouns? Can you repeat that story and say we hired a male rabbi, and it didn't work out, and so we can't hire another male rabbi?" It, of course, is absurd. But this is what happens to people who are not part of the privileged classes, is that people assume that you represent the whole group. Rabbi Memes Foller's probably had this happen to her as well, that when we were first ordained, people would say, "You're the first female rabbi I ever met," and they would assume that every female rabbi was like me or like her, as opposed to men who are seen as individuals. This is what happened to poor Judge Brown Jackson. She wasn't given the privilege of being white and male. She had to bite her tongue many times, and she was seen as having to represent her gender and her race. We need to learn to pay attention to these biases. It's important to have people who had different life experiences to be in positions of leadership because they bring different perspectives. And so I've been thinking about what we can learn from the tragedy of what happened to Nadav and Avihu as they brought their Eish Zarah, their foreign fire, today. One, we learn that our actions have consequences. Second, we learn that life would be unbearable if we were judged by a strict measure of justice. We'd only create one filled with compassion, one filled with love, one filled with a greater measure of justice. Amen.